You've just left a gathering. It was loud. It was social. You talked all night. You were not ignored. You were not excluded. You smiled when expected. You laughed at the right moments. You told the short version of your story, and nothing went wrong. That's what makes it confusing, because when you close your door behind you, the air inside your apartment feels different. Still, unobserved, you put your keys down. You exhale. Your face softens from the version of yourself you were holding, and something in your body drops. You feel tired in a way that sleep doesn't fix. Not physically tired, socially tired. There is a kind of fatigue that comes from being visible but not known, from being seen but not stored. It doesn't come from talking. It comes from starting over, from reintroducing yourself, from editing your history into a digestible version, from selecting safe details instead of meaningful ones, from deciding which parts of you fit into a room that doesn't yet understand you. You were surrounded by people, but nothing felt anchored. And that subtle lack of anchoring is what often gets mislabeled as loneliness. Not rejection, not exclusion, instability. Human beings are not just social. They are pattern-seeking inside social systems. Your brain builds relational continuity automatically. Every interaction becomes data. Tone, timing, micro-expressions, consistency, contradictions. You are mapping people constantly, even when you think you're just chatting. When someone reacts predictably over time, your nervous system begins to relax around them. When their behavior aligns across situations, your brain marks them as stable. And stability lowers vigilance. That lowering of vigilance is what connection feels like. Not excitement, not stimulation. Safety. The brain has systems specifically tuned to social familiarity. When you encounter someone repeatedly, threat responses decrease. Your internal alarm system quiets. You stop scanning for hidden meanings. You stop rehearsing responses in advance. You stop calculating. Familiarity reduces cognitive load, and reduced cognitive load feels like comfort. But familiarity requires repetition, and repetition requires time. And time shared with the same people is what modern life interrupts. Consider how many faces you encounter in a week. Co-workers, strangers, drivers, baristas, people in elevators, profiles on screens. Your brain absorbs all of them, but it cannot metabolize all of them. So it does what it must. It simplifies, it categorizes, it filters, not because it doesn't care, but because it has limits. There is a threshold beyond which social information becomes noise. And when social information becomes noise, depth thins. There's a reason stable groups feel different. When people see you repeatedly, something subtle happens. They witness your baseline. They know how you sound when you're calm. They know how you move when you're anxious. They know when something is slightly off. That is what allows someone to say, "You seem quieter than usual." That sentence is not casual. It means they have a reference point. And reference points are what make belonging real. Now imagine the opposite. You enter a new room. You are meeting 20 people for the first time. They are kind. They are open, but they have no archive of you. They are meeting tonight's version, and tonight's version must be clear, efficient, coherent. You present something smooth, something digestible, something that doesn't require context. And that presentation requires effort. You may not notice the effort in the moment, but your nervous system does, because performance always costs more than continuity. There is a number often cited in social psychology, around 150. That is roughly how many stable, emotionally mapped relationships the average human brain can maintain with nuance. Not surface familiarity, nuance. When that number expands beyond what your brain can meaningfully track, intimacy begins to flatten. People become roles instead of stories, functions instead of individuals, colleague, client, neighbor, follower. But belonging requires specificity, and specificity requires memory. Without repetition, your brain never shifts from evaluation to prediction. Evaluation is effortful. Prediction is efficient. In stable relationships, you predict. In unstable environments, you evaluate. Evaluation never fully turns off. That ongoing evaluation is exhausting. It feels like subtle tension. It feels like needing to stay alert. It feels like being slightly outside yourself. And when that state persists across weeks or months, it begins to resemble loneliness. Even when you are rarely alone, loneliness is not the absence of interaction. It is the absence of continuity. You can have conversations all day and still feel unheld, because interaction without accumulation is emotionally thin. It does not build. It resets, and reset after reset after reset creates fragmentation. When social bonds are stable, your body changes. Stress recovery improves. Inflammation markers decrease. Sleep stabilizes. Heart rhythms synchronize during shared emotional states. Attachment is not poetic language, it is biological regulation. When bonds lack continuity, regulation weakens. You may not consciously think, I feel socially unstable, but your body registers it. It tightens slightly, it scans slightly, it waits slightly. That slight waiting becomes fatigue. This is why certain gatherings drain you more than others. Not because of introversion, not because of social anxiety, but because of context. If you enter a room where no one knows your baseline, your system remains in introduction mode. If you enter a room where even one person holds your history, your nervous system softens. One anchor changes the entire room. And yet, modern life increasingly organizes itself around surface expansion. Networking, mobility, exposure, reach, growth, all of these prioritize breadth over depth, and breadth has advantages: opportunity, diversity, learning. But breadth without continuity produces thin attachment. Thin attachment produces subtle instability. And instability feels like loneliness, even inside crowds. There is a structure your nervous system expects, not a place, a pattern of recurring faces, recurring voices, recurring shared moments. Some researchers describe this as a village template, not a romantic image of stone houses and open fields. A relational structure, repeated interaction with the same people, witnessing each other across ordinary days, being seen not just in highlights, but in maintenance mode, in boredom, in stress, in the unremarkable middle of life. A village is not defined by size. It is defined by continuity. You see the same people tomorrow that you saw yesterday. You don't start from zero. You continue, and continuation is what stabilizes identity. In a stable environment, people accumulate you. They remember that you were anxious before your presentation. They remember how you reacted when your plan failed. They remember your humor, your hesitations, your rhythms. Over time, this accumulation becomes a shared archive, and something subtle happens inside you. You stop narrating yourself. You stop managing your impression constantly. You stop monitoring every word, because the archive already exists. You are not being assessed from scratch. You are being interpreted within context. That context lowers effort, and lowered effort feels like safety. In transient environments, there is no archive. You are perpetually in draft mode, always introducing, always summarizing, always presenting a clean arc. The messy middle of who you are, the unfinished parts, rarely surface, because unfinished parts require time. They require witnesses. They require someone who will still be there next week. When no one is guaranteed to remain, vulnerability becomes inefficient, so you stay polished, functional, surface level. And over time, surface level living begins to feel like disconnection, not because others reject you, but because no one holds your complexity long enough to integrate it. Let's make this more concrete. Imagine you move cities for work, you rebuild, you learn new streets, you meet new colleagues. You repeat your story, where you're from, what you do, why you moved. At first it feels exciting, then neutral, then slightly tiring, because each time you tell it, you compress it. You remove nuance. You make it efficient. After the 10th retelling, your own story starts to feel simplified. And when your story feels simplified, your identity feels thinner. Not lost, just less layered. Now imagine doing that every few years. New job, new building, new network. Always the new one. Always the person without shared history. Always slightly outside the archive. That constant reinvention creates a subtle psychological cost. It requires identity flexibility, which is valuable. But it also interrupts accumulation. And accumulation is what deep belonging depends on. There is another dimension here, predictability. In stable groups, your behavior becomes legible. People learn how you handle stress. You learn how they respond to conflict. Patterns emerge, and pattern recognition reduces uncertainty. When you know how someone will likely react, you relax. You don't have to prepare for every possibility. In unstable social environments, patterns don't have time to solidify. You remain in assessment mode. Assessment mode is alert mode. Alert mode is energy consuming, even if it's subtle, even if it feels normal. Now add the digital layer. Online interaction expands your reach, but it fragments your continuity. You may exchange messages with dozens of people in a day. You may receive likes, comments, replies. Each one activates micro signals of connection. Small dopamine releases, small hits of visibility. But visibility is not the same as being known. Most digital interactions do not accumulate shared memory. They spike, then vanish. There is no archive of shared physical experience, no layered witnessing, no ordinary time together, and the brain is calibrated for ordinary time. Not highlights, not curated moments. Ordinary time. When your social life shifts toward fragments instead of layers, your nervous system adapts. It becomes comfortable with breadth. but slightly deprived of depth. You may feel busy socially, but undernourished relationally, like eating constantly, but never fully satisfied, because stimulation and attachment are not the same thing. Stimulation is immediate, attachment is cumulative. Stimulation excites, attachment regulates. Without regulation, excitement eventually exhausts. There is also something subtle that happens to identity when continuity decreases. When the same people see you across years, they reflect parts of you back to yourself. They remind you who you were when you doubted yourself. They recall your earlier ambitions. They notice your growth. In stable relationships, your identity is co-constructed. You are remembered into yourself. When relationships are short-lived or fragmented, that reflective mirror weakens. No one holds the long arc of you, and without long arcs, identity feels moment-based, reactive, dependent on the current environment. This does not create dramatic crisis. It creates subtle drift, a feeling of being socially competent but existentially unanchored. Consider again the cafe example. You go to the same place for months. Eventually, someone knows your order, knows your rhythm, knows when you seem distracted. That tiny continuity begins to matter because it signals you are not anonymous here. Anonymity in small doses feels freeing. Anonymity in excess feels erasing. Humans do not thrive in total surveillance, but they also do not thrive in total invisibility. They need something in between: recognition without confinement, stability without entrapment. Modern life excels at invisibility. It is less skilled at sustainable recognition. This is why crowds can feel disorienting, not because they are hostile, but because they are memoryless. You can stand shoulder to shoulder with thousands of people, but if none of them carry yesterday with you, your nervous system does not settle. Crowds give you presence. Villages give you persistence. Presence feels alive. Persistence feels safe. Both matter, but when persistence disappears, presence alone cannot sustain attachment. There is an important correction here. The goal is not to shrink your world, not to avoid cities, not to reject technology. The goal is calibration, to understand what your nervous system expects, so you can design accordingly. Because belonging no longer happens automatically. It must be built, and building requires intention. In modern life, repetition is optional. You can always move, switch, upgrade, reconfigure. There is always a new room, a new network, a new possibility. Choice is empowering, but unlimited choice fragments continuity, and fragmented continuity destabilizes attachment, which brings us to the core tension. Freedom has expanded, continuity has thinned, and your brain still expects continuity. So when you feel lonely in a crowd, the feeling is not irrational. It is not weakness. It is feedback. Your system signaling that it has proximity, but lacks accumulation, interaction, but not integration, visibility, but not memory. That signal is quiet. It does not shout. It simply lingers. A subtle sense of floating, of being socially active, but internally untethered. And this is where most people misunderstand themselves. They assume the solution is more exposure, more events, more conversations, more presence. But if the problem is continuity, adding more novelty does not solve it. It increases the gap. The solution is not expansion. It is layering. There is something almost invisible about this kind of loneliness. It does not look dramatic. You are functioning. You are capable. You are socially active. But inside, something feels slightly ungrounded, like you are moving through rooms instead of inhabiting them, like conversations pass through you instead of building around you, like your life is happening, but not accumulating. That is the cost of continuity loss, and it rarely announces itself loudly. It whispers. When continuity thins, you begin to live in present tense only. Today's meeting, tonight's event, this week's interaction. But belonging requires past tense, shared history, reference points, the ability to say, you remember when, without needing to explain the backstory, without needing to summarize who you are again, without needing to justify your emotional shifts. Belonging is not intensity. It is accumulation. There is also something else that happens when social continuity is unstable. You begin to subtly monitor yourself more closely. You track how you're being perceived. You adjust language. You smooth rough edges. You become slightly more strategic. This is not manipulation. It is adaptation. But adaptation consumes energy. When you adapt constantly, you rarely rest inside yourself. And without rest, social life becomes performance, not connection. Performance can look impressive, but it does not regulate the nervous system. It does not allow your shoulders to drop fully. It does not allow your thoughts to wander without fear of misinterpretation. It keeps you slightly composed, and long-term composure without release becomes fatigue. Think about the last time you were with someone who truly knows you, someone who has seen you at your worst and remained. Notice what changes. Your speech slows. Your tone softens. You don't edit as much. Silence becomes tolerable. You don't fill gaps with explanation. You do not feel observed. You feel accompanied. That difference is profound. It is the difference between being evaluated and being held, between being introduced and being continued. Modern life rewards reinvention. You can pivot careers, change cities, rebrand yourself, start over socially at any time. And this is powerful. It creates opportunity. But every reinvention resets accumulation. Every reset interrupts layering. And too many resets create identity fragmentation. You may not consciously think, I don't know who I am. But you may feel less integrated, less remembered, less solid across time. Because identity stabilizes when others hold it with you. When no one holds your longer arc, you must hold it alone. And holding your entire narrative alone is heavier than it seems. There is something humbling here. Belonging used to be largely environmental. You were born into continuity. You did not have to curate it. You did not have to design it. You inherited it. Now continuity is optional, and optional things require effort, which means belonging must be architectural, designed, protected, repeated intentionally. This does not mean shrinking your world. It means anchoring it. You can live in a city and still build continuity. You can move and still maintain depth. But it requires something modern culture does not automatically encourage: staying, returning, choosing the same faces long enough for performance to dissolve, choosing environments that allow history to build, choosing people not for novelty, but for durability. Durability is unfashionable. It is not exciting, it is not optimized, but durability creates memory, and memory creates belonging. You do not need 100 anchors. You need a few people who expect you, a few places that notice your absence, a few conversations that do not restart from zero, a few shared references that make you exhale. That is enough. Neurologically, that is enough. There is a quiet shift that happens when you stop chasing expansion and start designing layering. You begin to measure connection differently, not by how many people you interacted with this week, but by how many interactions accumulated, not by how visible you were, but by how remembered you are, not by how impressive your social life appears, but by how grounded it feels. This is not regression. It is recalibration. And here is the subtle truth beneath all of it. You were never meant to be known by everyone. You were meant to be known deeply by a few. Crowds can energize, they can inspire, they can expose you to ideas and opportunities, but they cannot replace continuity. They cannot replace memory. They cannot replace the slow construction of shared narrative. When you feel lonely in a crowd, it is not because you dislike people. It is not because you are socially incapable. It is not because you are broken. It is because your nervous system is still calibrated for accumulation, for repetition, for faces that return, for conversations that continue, for stories that layer instead of reset. And when that calibration meets endless turnover, it sends a signal, not dramatic, not urgent, just steady. Find depth. Stay long enough to be remembered. Allow someone to carry yesterday with you. If you have ever felt invisible in a room full of people, if you have ever left an event feeling strangely hollow despite nothing going wrong, if you have ever wondered why connection feels thinner even though interaction is constant, there is nothing wrong with your capacity to bond. Your brain still expects continuity. It still expects shared memory. It still expects to be held across time, not just in the moment. And understanding that alone changes something, because confusion becomes clarity, and clarity reduces shame. That is what this space is about. Not urgency, not optimization, not chasing reach, but slowing down enough to understand the quiet mismatches between how humans are built and how modern life is arranged. If that kind of thinking resonates with you, subscribe. There is more to explore. And if this helped you name something you've felt for a long time, then the crowd already feels a little less lonely.